Good morning and welcome to the final session of the AHDB Dairy Research Conference session. This morning's session is on optimizing young stock performance. We've had a very hectic week and heard a lot of very interesting information on all of the research that's been carried out that was funded by levy payers over the last 5 years through the research partnership. We're grateful to all those who were involved in delivering the research, the researchers and the PhD students. And we're also very grateful to those farmers who took part in the research and allowed the research to be carried out on their farms. This morning's session on optimizing young stock performance will cover much of the research that's been carried out in relation to calf health and welfare. All of the attendees will be muted throughout the presentations and throughout this session, but you are able to submit sessions throughout. If you go to the questions box on the right hand side, you can enter your questions and we will put those to the presenters at the end. We will have two films in this morning's session and the presenters are not with us today, but if you have questions specifically for them, we will answer those questions offline. Please, when you put your questions in the question box, it will be helpful if you put the name of the presenter in there so we know who to direct that question to. So please submit your questions throughout. We will aim to finish by 12:30 this afternoon, and the recording will be made available after the event. A survey will pop up at the end of the presentations and this session, and it will be really helpful if you can complete that survey because the feedback is very useful and will also help us to deliver the on-farm roadshows next year, which Tim mentioned at the end of his introduction. So the first part of this session is a film. It's from David Bell, who completed his PhD at the Scottish Rural College, SRUC, on the impact of early life thermal environment on calf performance. So we will now play that film, and if you have any questions, please do put them in the questions box and we will get back to you with answers from David. Thank you.
So this study comes from a project that was looking at the factors affecting the calf housing environment. And this study in particular was interested in the very early weeks of life and the impact that had on the calves' performance and growth. So some of the key take-home messages from this one are just to emphasise how important these early weeks of life are and the impact that the environment can have on the growth of this calf, sometimes not in a positive way. And that if we're going to be monitoring the calf housing environment, then we maybe need to start and think of beyond average. So our calf has been born and it faces many challenges ahead. The first one being quite topical, and that is climate change. So calves in the UK are exposed to temperatures that are dramatically lower than what they're used to within the uterus. So our job is to try and maintain these calves in the most thermally comfort environment possible. So thermal comfort, I'm not really going to go into too much detail today, but I like to think of it in terms of Goldilocks and the three bears. So as the environmental temperature starts to get higher, we then reach a point known as the upper critical temperature. And as Goldilocks says, this is too warm for the calf. And if we go to the opposite end of the scale and the environmental temperature starts to get colder, we then reach a point known as the lower critical temperature. And yep, you've guessed it, Goldilocks would say that's too cold. So what thermal comfort is trying to do is to try and achieve this just right temperature for the calf. In our study, we were concentrating more on looking at the lower critical temperature. But what exactly is the lower critical temperature? Well, the lower critical temperature is a point where the calf needs to change what it's doing to maintain its core body temperature. Will this be behaviourally? So it might change its posture, or it might go to a different part of the pen, or we then have to increase the amount of energy that we supply to that calf. It's estimated that the lower critical temperature for a newborn calf is in the region of 15 degrees. And as this calf starts to get older, the lower critical temperature gradually starts to decrease, with estimates of when the calf reaches about 1 month of life that it is touching about 0. But there's a lot of things that can affect the lower critical temperature, and one of these is the breed of the calf itself. So the lower critical temperature for a Jersey calf will be much higher than that for a purebred Holstein. In this study, we looked at over 300 calves that were born from an all-year-round calving herd, and we looked at these from July one year to June the following year. And we monitored these calves for essentially the first month of life, taking various measurements from the calf housing environment and the calf itself. These calves, once they were born, were placed into an individual hutch where they remained for 6 to 14 days, and then they were moved on to a group housing pen. So on the left, we can see the minimum and maximum monthly recorded temperatures throughout the project. These are in the blue and the red lines, with the black line representing the mean monthly recorded temperature and the green dashed line representing the lower critical temperature. So as you can see, at the start of the project, we had months where the average temperature was above the lower critical temperature for calves, which is quite good. However, these calves, as it can be seen, were still exposed to temperatures below their lower critical temperature. But as everyone knows, it's not just about air temperature within calf housing. There's other factors as well. So we calculated something called the effective temperature. This is essentially a feels-like temperature for the calf. The effective temperature incorporates not only air temperature, but also wind speed and relative humidity. And had we had solar radiation data, we can incorporate that as well to get a more fuller picture of what that calf was feeling. So we looked at the proportion of hours that the calf was exposed to its effective temperature that was below its lower critical temperature. So the plot on the left shows the date of birth range for the calves and how they were subsequently grouped. So as you can see, the calves that were born between about December and February spent a large proportion of their time in the hutch when they were essentially exposed to temperatures below their lower critical temperature. The plot on the right, when we start to look at these calves individually, it shows that calves that were exposed to effective temperatures below their LCT for more than 58% of the time they were in the hutch, this had a negative effect on their daily live weight gain. So essentially, these calves were starting to lose weight. So what can be done to overcome this issue? Well, the simplest thing we could do was apply more bedding. So essentially to allow the calf to nest into that straw and create its own little microclimate. Other things we could do is possibly put that calf under a heat lamp for a proportion of the time, or to simply apply a calf jacket. However, there's various results regarding calf jackets and possibly more information is needed on that. So finally, just to reiterate some of the key take-home messages is not to underestimate the importance of the environment for these calves in the early stages of life, because we are trying to build this calf on to have a productive future. The housing environment, as it's been shown, can have an effect on the impact on the growth of the calf. And finally, if we are going to be monitoring the calf housing environment, just to remember that there's more things we can do other than just simply record the average. Finally, if anyone is interested to see more about the study in its entirety, then please refer to the publication that is mentioned on the bottom of the screen. And finally, I wish to take this opportunity to thank AHDB for providing funding for this studentship, along with the various people who provided supervision or training or providing facilities for this research work to be carried out. Thank you.
Thank you very much to David for that presentation and for all the hard work that went into carrying out that research, and to all the farmers and other researchers who were involved in delivering that research. There's been some pretty interesting findings there. And as David says, there are further details have already been published. Our next presentation is from Robert Hyde, who's doing his PhD at the University of Nottingham with support from the AHDB Dairy Levy Funds. And his presentation is going to cover practical housing and management changes for healthy and productive calves. So over to you, Robert.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, AHDB, for having me along, and also for the funding for the PhD. It wouldn't have happened otherwise. So today we're going to talk about some housing management outcomes for getting the best out of calves on dairy farms, whether that's beef cross calves or pure dairy calves. If we can go on to the next slide. So we know dairy calves sometimes get a little bit of a rough deal on dairy farms. There's a lot of things going on dairy farms. The adult cows obviously need milking, but there's lots of other health and welfare issues that are being tackled with them as well. And sometimes I think if we're honest with ourselves, sometimes the calves slip down the list a little bit and kind of slightly go to the bottom of the pile when it comes to kind of proactive management and housing changes. And we know that about 1 in 5 calves fails to get passive transfer, so they don't get enough immunity from their colostrum. About half of calves get diarrhea in the pre-weaning period, about half of calves get respiratory disease, and about 1 in 20 calves die. And we know from research and from our experience on farms that actually they sometimes slip down the list, as I was saying, and young stock health has been kind of reported to be less important when compared with adult cow diseases. So what we've done during this PhD, and if we can go on to the next slide, it is try and use some statistical learning techniques, and by statistical learning, what I mean is machine learning or AI, artificial intelligence, to try and pick apart which things on a dairy farm are really the most important things in terms of predicting whether an animal gets sick or not, whether an animal dies or not, and whether they grow well or not. And you can see on the left-hand side here, just a few of the things that might impact whether calves do well or not. So the stocking density, the herd size, the colostrum they're fed, what kind of buildings they're in. There's thousands of different parameters that might be important there, and it's very difficult for us as vets and farmers to say, right, this is the thing that we really need to focus on if we want to have the biggest impact on our calves. So that's really what the study's about, and these kind of algorithms, you'll see in your figuring out what's spam email and what's not, and what films to watch next on Netflix and things like that. And these kind of algorithms are everywhere, and we're really taking these algorithms and these techniques and applying them to animal health. Moving on to the next slide. The first part of the study was looking at calf mortality. So the data set we had available was BCMS data from the whole country for nearly the last decade, so between 2011 and 2018, which is over 20 million deaths worth of data. We looked at where those animals were born, but also where they ended up dying. So quite a lot of animals died at slaughterhouses, you might expect, but quite a lot of animals also died on farm, and it was really those animals that we focused on. We looked at when animals died, and about 25% of animals died within the first 3 months of life, which is an enormous number of deaths, considering it's such a short time period compared with the rest of the animals' lives. And we also looked at what kind of factors would be associated with mortality of animals, what kind of things would make animals dying on farm more likely, and things that we found were important were breed, sex, the month they were born in, and also the environmental temperature, national Met Office temperatures. Go on to the next slide. So this graph there's quite a lot of information here, but it's quite nice to show some of the patterns that we found. So you can see the mortality rate for calves on the y-axis, so up and down the side there. And there's some quite key differences. So the first difference to focus on is the difference between the two colours. So they're coloured by male and female. And you can see across all of the months going left to right, and for both beef calves at the top and dairy calves at the bottom, male calves were more likely to die on farm. They had a higher mortality rate than female calves. So we've got to ask the question, is that just because they're male, or is there something about how we're managing male calves that make them slightly more likely to die? The same can be said for the difference between beef and dairy. And if you look at the axis on the left-hand side, up and down the lines there, you can see that beef calves generally about between 2 and 5% die. But if you look on the bottom left-hand side, you can see it's somewhere probably between about 5 and 10% of dairy calves are dying within the pre-weaning period. And of course, it's worse if you're a dairy male. So in the bottom left plot, you can see if it's a January and you're a dairy calf and you happen to be male, then you're much more likely to die than maybe if you look in one of the middle panels in June or July, where if you were a beef calf and you're also female, you've maybe only got a 2% chance of dying compared with a 9% chance of dying if you're a male calf born in January. There's also a really interesting effect of temperature here as well. And you can see of all the Januaries, for example, if you look at that bottom left plot again, you can see of all the Januaries that we had data on, so from 2011 to 2018, there's multiple Januaries there, and of course it's a slightly different average temperature in each January. And you can see that the colder that January was, the more calves seemed to die, the higher the mortality rate was. And that's true for pretty much all of the winter months and some of the spring months, and certainly most of the autumn as well. And you can see that really striking trend. Basically, the warmer it gets, the less calves die. That line really kind of points down to the bottom right. Most of those graphs, the ones in the middle between kind of June and August, or May and August, the line's much flatter, and that means there's much less of an effect of temperature because they're already in this kind of Goldilocks temperature zone, as David's just been talking about. It's already warm enough, so increasing it by another 1 or 2 degrees when it's already 13, 14 degrees is not going to make much difference. But when it's much colder in January and February, when it's only averaging about 4 degrees, actually every 1 degree really does make a difference then in terms of temperatures. There's some quite interesting patterns there in terms of mortality outcomes, and temperature certainly seems to be very important, along with the breed and the sex of the animal and the month they're born in. So some key kind of environment and management factors that seem to be involved there, particularly for male dairy calves, which don't always get quite as good treatment as they could do. Next slide, please. The kind of core part of this AHDB funded PhD project was to develop a calf health plan. So to come up with the key things that we thought were important in terms of putting a calf health plan in place on any dairy farm in the country, we went to 60 dairy farms randomly selected across the whole country, and we looked at a whole range of information on each one of those farms. We visited the farms, we took measurements of every building those animals were in, we put data loggers in every building so we could track the temperature and the humidity of those buildings every 15 minutes, and we did that over a 6-month period. We also took over 1,000 management questions down and recorded the kind of environments the calves were born in. We had total proteins, so from blood samples from calves to see their immunity. We had colostrum bacteriology samples. We knew what kind of levels of colostrum they were being fed, what kind of milk they were being fed, and then the farmers would record birth weight and weaning weight, so we could calculate growth rates, and also look at morbidity and mortality, so disease and death, and then we could pair the two up and see, out of these 1,000 things that we recorded on 60 farms, what are the key things to improve growth rates, reduce disease and death rates as well. Next slide, please. So some of the key things that we identified here as being important, some of them won't be new to you, and there's some really good AHDB resources on some of these things already, but it's quite reassuring that out of thousands of things that we looked at, some of these really core things come back as being important. Colostrum particularly, feeding enough colostrum was really, really important. So feeding between 3 and 4 litres of colostrum within 6 hours of birth, and making sure that colostrum is really clean when you're doing so is really important. There's some great AHDB colostrum resources available that I'd thoroughly suggest going and looking at to make sure your colostrum management is up to date. And these are things that we've talked about a lot in the past, I think, in conversations with farmers, but it's still things that we don't always get right, and quite a lot of people were still feeding quite low levels of colostrum. Similarly with feeding, when you get onto milk feeding as well, lots of people still feeding kind of 4 or 5 litres of milk a day really isn't enough for a growing calf, and getting them up to 6 or 8 litres fairly quickly, and potentially with whole milk as well, although that's certainly worth a conversation with your vet to make sure there's no risk of disease transmission there in terms of Yonis and TB and so on. Hygiene we found to be very important as well, and cleaning out calf pens every 30 days and calving pens every 21 days we found to be very important as well in terms of growth rates. And in terms of the housing, again, we found temperature to be really important. And two main ways you can increase that. It's very difficult actually to increase temperature in terms of altering the building design, but in terms of providing them with plenty of soft, clean, dry bedding is really important to allow the calf to nest down into that bedding and to get themselves warm. And also you can consider giving them supplementary heat sources like a patio heaters or heat lamps and things like that, as I'll come on to a little bit later on. Next slide, please. So whilst we did quite a lot of research on these 60 farms and spent quite a lot of time making sure that we were happy that we had kind of the very most important things available, what we really wanted to do was to test this plan. It's all very well thinking that these are the things that are important in theory, but we really wanted to test that this would actually work in real life conditions. So we went back to 60 farms and we split them randomly so that half of the farms would get this health plan based on these top 20 most important factors, and the other half of the farms would get nothing at all, and they would just record and they would get the plan after the trial was finished, so that we could really see if we put this plan into place on farms, what does it do in real life conditions. Next slide, please. So here are some of the results, and there's quite a lot on this slide, but there's quite a lot of interesting information here. If you look at the top two panels there, this is the growth rates of calves, depending on how many points out of the plan that farm was doing. So of those farms, if you do more things from the plan, if you do kind of 12, 15 things out of the plan, your calves are probably going to grow quite a lot faster than if you were doing only a few things from that plan over that time period. Same kind of pattern, well, the reverse pattern, but the same kind of effect for diarrhea and mortality rates as well. The more things you do from that plan, the lower your rates of disease and death were as well. So it seems to kind of bear out in practice, and people doing more things from the plan tended to have lower disease and death rates and higher rates of growth. Didn't see quite such a good pattern with pneumonia rates, which seemed much more flat across the board. We think that's probably just due to the difficulties in detecting pneumonia. Very challenging to accurately diagnose pneumonia, so there's probably a bit of underdiagnosis going on in there. And it's certainly something we'd like to look at maybe in future studies. Next slide, please. So we found from all of that previous work that the environment that the calves are in, it seems to be very, very important, both in terms of the hygiene, the feeding, but also in terms of the temperature. So to really pick apart that temperature, we decided to do a further study to really look at temperature on its own and what things can we do to improve temperature to increase growth rates. So we decided to do a randomized control trial, an RCT, where we basically enrolled animals from a single large dairy farm into one of four groups. So we either just had that calf on its own with no heat and no jacket, or we allocated that calf randomly to just a heat lamp but without a calf jacket, or we gave them a jacket but no heat lamp, or we gave them both a heat lamp and a jacket. So we had four different treatments there. And we were really hoping to pull out from this study whether giving them a heat lamp, a patio heater in this case, or giving them a jacket, or a combination of the two, was going to be the best in terms of increasing their temperature and therefore increasing their growth rates. Next slide, please. So the results from that study were quite interesting, and you can see, regardless of whether animals had a jacket or didn't have a jacket, if you look at the left and the right hand sides there, the heat lamp, the calves under a heat lamp, a patio 1 kilowatt heater in this case, seem to grow quite considerably faster than those without the heat lamp. So there's some health and safety things to point out there, of course. Don't go hanging heat lamps from baler twine and so on above straw if you are going to put heat lamps in. But in this case, we use steel cable, hang them from something solid. You don't want to be going down the route of barn fires. And they do cost money to run, of course, as well. So working out if it's economically worthwhile for your farm is certainly worth doing. But there does seem to be an effect of heat lamp. Didn't seem to be too much difference in terms of jacket effect on growth rates. Next slide, please. So looking at the actual temperature of the calves, you can see there is a bit of a pattern. The warmer the calves were in that study, the better they grew. And if we add on all the data from previous trials onto there as well, then there actually seems to be a bit more of an effect. So if we overlay a line for each farm within that study. So within the heat lamp study and all of the other 60 farms that we had on farm, you can see that, okay, there's a couple of outliers where the lines go the wrong way. But for almost all the farms, there's a pretty similar increase. As temperatures get warmer, calves tend to grow a little bit better. And this is quite interesting. It's something that maybe we haven't really talked about that much in the industry previously. And people tend to kind of give the advice that as long as you feed them enough, calves will grow regardless of temperature. This data tends to suggest that's not true, and they are quite susceptible to colder temperatures. So certainly worth thinking about. We do have to play this against ventilation, so don't go shutting down all the sides of the buildings and so on to try and increase your temperatures, because of course you will then get pneumonia because there's not enough air circulation. But giving them plenty of clean, warm, dry straw to nest into, or giving them some sort of heat source is certainly worth considering to increase growth rates. Next slide, please. So if you'd like to give that plan a go, when we put it on the Nottingham University Herd Health Toolkit, so you can either Google Nottingham Herd Health Toolkit or go to the link on the bottom left there. Within that toolkit, there's lots of different tools available, so you can play around with some of the mortality models that we've created and try sliding up and down different temperatures to see the effect on mortality at a national level. There's lots of calf growth rate things and colostrum bacteriology calculators. And there's also the calf health plan, which we've put on there as well, and that's freely available if you want to have a play with that. All you need to do is log on there and just put in the details for your herd. So the amount of, in this case, calvings in a dedicated calving pen and how often you clean it out. You'll get some key recommendations there and then. You can also download a bespoke report as well, which will kind of benchmark your farm against other farms that were on the trial as well. So go and have a play with that if you'd like to learn more. So with that, I will conclude on the next slide. Thank you. So just thanks to the rest of the team, Pete, Martin, and Chris, the farmers participating in the trial, University of Nottingham, AFCP, and of course AHDB for funding as well for the PhD, as it wouldn't happen otherwise. And thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Robert. Another very interesting presentation, and a lot of hard work has gone in there into investigating the factors that affect calf health and growth rates. There will be an opportunity to ask probably questions at the end of the session. So please enter any questions into the question panels, which should be shown on the right-hand side of your screen. You may need to click the little arrow beside the questions to open up the area where you can enter your questions. But thank you to Robert, the research team at the University of Nottingham, and to all those farmers who took part in that research. We move now on to the next stage of young stock management and optimizing heifer grazing systems, which is going to be presented by Robert Patterson. Robert has undertaken his postgraduate studies at the Agri-Food Biosciences Institute in Hillsborough, and he's now working with Capri and Greenman as a dairying technologist. So over to you, Robert, on optimizing heifer grazing systems.
Thanks, Derek. Yes, good morning, everyone. And as Derek said, we'll be looking at optimizing heifer grazing systems, and specifically 2 pasture line studies which were carried out. Next slide, please. So as by way of introduction, obviously heifer rearing is a significant cost to the dairying business, second only to the cost of feed. And so it's crucially important that we get value for money and we utilize the most economical resources that we have available. There's a large range in post-weaning practices in heifer rearing. Obviously, over the years, there's been a lot of good work done into the pre-weaning period, but post-weaning, there hasn't been so much work done, and especially within grazing systems. And as Bobby alluded to earlier, heifer rearing is a commonly overlooked aspect of the dairying system, but it is a critically important stage. It's the future of the herd and the business. So in terms of these heifers, well, what do we need these heifers to do? Well, there's been many studies over the years which have concluded that 24-month calving is optimal, both for increasing productivity, fertility, and the likelihood of survival in the herd. And 24-month calving is something that we can directly control through breeding and nutrition decisions. A heifer calving at 24 months should be in calf at 15 months, and for that to happen, she needs to have began puberty at 13 months. And the onset of puberty is directly related to nutrition and achieving target live weight gains at those critical times. And ultimately, this heifer has to produce a return on investment. You know, she is a non-productive stage of her life there, from birth until entering the dairy herd, which is a big cost against it. And she needs to be coming into the herd in a fit and healthy way, ready to crack on and stay in the herd long enough to pay for herself. In terms of grass, grass it's an understated resource. You know, it's the cheapest source of feed that we have in ruminant livestock systems, and incorporating as much grass into the diet of heifer replacements can only be positive from a financial point of view. Grass is hard to manage. There's no getting around that. You know, it follows a seasonal growth curve, and there's weather implications there as well. So trying to maintain heifers to achieve targets consistently across the season when grass growth and quality is doing all kinds of crazy things is always going to be a challenge. So the objective of the PhD and these studies was, well, what is the role of grazed grass in these systems? You know, more and more we're dealing with high genetic merit dairy animals. You know, is there a role for grazed grass in these systems with rearing these heifers? What is the potential of grass, and how can we optimize that? Next slide, please. So the first study we conducted was a pasture allowance study, and this was for maiden heifers. These were high PLI Holstein dairy heifers coming out of an autumn calving. So they were weaned, and then they were on a silage and concentrate diet, and then they were turned out on the 1st of March. They were acclimatized to grazing for 3 weeks and transitioned down off the concentrate to a grass-only diet. And then they were on a pasture allowance study for 159 days from the end of March until September. So in terms of pasture allowance, there's guidelines there out in the industry, but there was no specific targets or percentages that they should have been fed to, and there was no information on what the implication for that was in terms of pasture productivity and quality. In terms of dairy cow research, you know, in terms of grazing, there's been a lot of work done there over the years, and a lot of that has concluded, yes, you can reduce your pasture allowance and you might reduce milk production per cow, but you could increase milk production per hectare. However, when you translate that over into the heifer grazing, you know, we can't increase live weight gain per hectare and reduce it per heifer, because we need to meet those critical target live weight gains for the heifers. So the objective of this study was, what is the optimum pasture allowance for these heifers? We'll go on to the next slide, please. So without getting bogged down too much into the materials and the methods, there was 3 pasture allowance studies, or 3 pasture allowances focused on, which were 1.8, 2.4 and 3% of their body weight. So that was a percentage of their body weight in terms of kilograms of grazed grass allocated per day per heifer. So these heifers were on average 155 kilos and 5 months of age when they went on to this study. And to avoid the field having an impact on the position on the field and the weather, the treatments were divided into 3. So we had 9 groups of 8 heifers in each, and they had 7 paddocks which they rotationally rotated around each rotation. There was no additional sward interventions used, so there was no topping, there was no mowing, and there was nitrogen applied rotationally as well. So we wanted to see what was the effect on the heifers at these different alliances, but we also wanted to look at the grass. You know, how much were we able to grow, how much were we able to utilize, and what was the implications of the quality of the grass subsequently building up through those rotations across the season. Next slide, please. Here we have some results, and if we think about those targets, you know, for a Holstein cow with an average mature cow weight of 650 kilos, we really need to be targeting 0.75 to 0.8 kilos of live weight gain per day, each day of life, up until that point of calving. So as we can see here, the pasture allowance of 3% for the maiden heifers was achieving that with no additional concentrate supplementation included. We can see a difference there of 0.22 kilos a day between the highest and the lowest. And obviously these heifers at the 1.8% pasture allowance, they're not going to be achieving their target live weight gains and potentially delaying breeding and calving. So, but the good news story there, 3% grass only, no concentrates, high PLI Holstein heifers were hitting those targets. In terms of grass utilization, as we would have expected, we have a 15% reduction in utilization from the lowest to the highest treatment. Grass growth per rotation, the results weren't significant in terms of the difference there, but they are not in the order that we would have expected, but I'll touch on that again in a minute. And the grazing area, so this is a multiplication of area. If this was a group of 30 heifers, these are the different areas and hectares that would have been required. So as we'd expected, there's an increase there, but again, I'll touch on that in a minute. Next slide, please. So just looking in a bit more detail in the live weight of those maiden heifers, we can see that from across the study, there's a continual divergence in the live weight of these heifers across the different pasture alliances. However, whilst there's a continual divergence, the three alliance treatments also follow a similar theme, and when one goes up, they all go up, sort of thing. If we look here from day 132 to 154 in the graph, we can see a real period of stagnation. This coincided with a period of about 12 days where we had 117 mils of rain, and there was only one of those 12 days where there was no rain. So this was a really difficult time for these heifers out. There was no shelter in these paddocks, they were exposed, and as we can see here, the lower pasture allowance there, 1.8 in the blue line, they actually went back over that 2-week period. We can see some compensatory growth out the back of that, but as we can see, you know, environment, weather had a big impact there. Next slide, please. So moving on then, so these heifers went into the shed after that first study, and those heifers that hadn't achieved their growth targets had to be caught up over that winter period. They were served, they were scanned in calf, and they were back out the following season for their second grazing season before calving down in September. So there have been studies done there back in 2015, and they showed that, you know, maintaining that pregnant heifer at grass decreased the cost of keeping her by £1.75 per day. And there's also been numerous studies looking into the effect of the weight and the body condition score of heifers calving in, and the fact that has on their subsequent lactation. So we didn't want to overfeed these heifers, but we didn't want them to be underfed either. So again, we looked at the same three pasture allowances, the 1.8, the 2.4, and the 3% of their body weight. Next slide, please. The results here again, however, we can see that this time the 2.4% pasture allowance was sufficient to achieve that target live weight gain of between 0.75 and 0.8. We can see at the higher pasture allowance there, the heifers are growing, they're growing too much. There's 0.91 there. Again, this is all off grass, no concentrates used, but those heifers were going to be calving in with too high a weight and too great a condition score than we would have liked. Again, grass utilization, there was a difference there, but a greater difference that we had seen in the first study, a difference here of 22% between the highest and the lowest treatments. And grass growth per rotation, again, not as we would have expected. the higher grass allocation growing more. I would have hypothesized that the lower grass allocation, the animals would have been cleaning it off, there would have been better post-grazing residuals, and that would have stimulated better growth. However, that is not what we saw. And in terms of the area required then for the heifers, again, we can see that extrapolated up for a group of 30 heifers. Next slide, please. This graph shows the grass produced per rotation, and as we were saying, it's not just as we would have expected. Those figures show that the higher pasture allowance treatments were growing more grass. However, this goes some way to explain that. We can see in rotation 2 that the higher pasture allowance there in the yellow bar greatly exceeded the other 2 treatments, and I suppose one of the reasons for this we could have picked out, going in, we were slightly delayed getting out that spring. It was into the 2nd week of April, and we were going into quite heavy covers in the first rotation, covers over 3,600. The heifers on the lower pasture allowance, because the paddock area was governed by the amount of the pasture height, they were getting very small areas, and coinciding with poor weather conditions, those paddocks received quite a bit of poaching, which has probably really stunted the growth, the regrowth of the grass in those paddocks. Next slide, please. So this graph just shows the utilisation across the different treatments and throughout the rotations in the study. As we can see here, the utilisation follows the same trend across all rotations. However, we can see that they all dip slightly from the first rotation to the 3rd rotation. However, in the 4th rotation, they all seem to improve slightly again. Again, we can relate this back to weather, with conditions being quite poor across the first 3 rotations, and rotation 4 actually coming in just before some drought conditions were experienced. There were a lot better grazing conditions in rotation 4, and we can see the impact that that had on the utilisation. Next slide, please. So this is just a visual demonstration of the differences in pasture allowance. The middle one there is the 2.4% allocation, which was ideal for these in-calf heifers, and we can see there, compared to the higher allocation where they were going to be growing too much at 0.9, we're saving 2.7 kilos of dry matter there per heifer per day, which is a valuable resource. Next slide, please. Again, just extrapolating out the area used for these heifers, we can see the differences there. And what should be bore in mind when we look at these results, the trial was under quite high nitrogen application, so there was 220 kilos of nitrogen applied per hectare in these studies. And if we were moving this to a lower nitrogen input or a more extensive grazing system, then these figures would obviously be a lot different, and there'd be more variation within them. Next slide, please. So key take-home messages in terms of pasture allowance for the maiden heifers, with no extra concentrate supplementation or forage is fed, no sward interventions, 3% of their body weight, and they were able to achieve 0.82 kilos of live weight gain per day across the entire grazing season. However, for the in-calf heifers, there was a reduction in that to 2.4%, and if we had maintained them at 3%, they would have been too great a condition coming into calving. It's also showed that to target greater pasture allowance, if heifers are above target, you can pull them back, and I suppose it depends on what your situation is as a farm. If you have the land available, perhaps pushing more off it then is viable. However, if it's pasture utilization that you really need to focus on, potentially some supplementation to boost up to your targets from the live weights that we were experiencing at those higher utilizations would be appropriate. But ultimately, I suppose it's a phrase that has been coined and maybe overused over the past while, but you can't manage what you don't measure. An accurate and regular recording of heifers over over their lifetime, and especially over the grazing season, is a valuable and worthwhile exercise. Next slide. Yep, so that's the end of my presentation, and if we go on one more slide, I'd just like to acknowledge AHDB and their funding for AFBI, AgResearch, Queen's University Belfast, and the Department of Agriculture. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Robert, to you and to the team for all that excellent work. You know, the importance of getting heifers to the target weight at calving can't be overemphasized, and doing that as efficiently as possible and making the best use of grazed grass is something that we're all going to be concentrating even more on in the future as part of our response to climate change. So thank you very much to you and the team. And we, again, if you've got questions for Robert, please put them in the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will come to all of those questions at the end of the formal presentations. The next presentation is on the role of adult cattle in the transmission of Cryptosporidium to dairy calves. And we're going to have a filmed presentation from Dr. Hannah Shaw, who completed her PhD in 2019 at the Moordun and is now working at Harper Adams University, where she's a lecturer in veterinary health and animal sciences. So we're moving now to more of a health challenge for young stock, and a key area to address in optimizing young stock performance. Thank you.
Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about the role of adult cattle in the transmission of Cryptosporidium parvum to dairy calves. So this was one of the chapters that I did for my PhD, and it's essentially trying to determine where our dairy calves are actually picking up these Cryptosporidium oocysts from within their environment, and looking at the role that adult cattle could potentially play within this transmission. So let's start off with describing a little bit about Cryptosporidium and what it is. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, Cryptosporidium is a protozoan parasite. It's transmitted via the fecal-oral route with about 44 recognized species, and there are many more genotypes as well, which may eventually become sort of new species with further research. Some of these species are zoonotic, which means that it has the ability to move from animal into human, and so therefore there is a public health risk with this particular parasite. The human outbreaks tend to be associated through contaminated drinking water and also contaminated recreational water, so things like swimming pools and such like. So it tends to affect young children. The main symptoms of cryptosporidiosis are watery diarrhea, so it's a gastrointestinal parasite. We end up with abdominal pain, loss of appetite, and if it is in an immunocompromised person or a very young or a very old person, it can sometimes lead to sort of severe dehydration and sometimes death as well. And this is also the case within our animals, which also get Cryptosporidium. So specifically as part of my PhD, I was looking at Cryptosporidium in calves. And so the most common species which is detected within young calves is Cryptosporidium parvum. There are other species which infect calves as well. However, these haven't been associated with clinical signs of the disease as yet. And so it's Cryptosporidium parvum which tends to be the main focus of research within calves. It's a real problem on farm because the oocysts are really environmentally stable, so they're quite difficult to get rid of within the environment, and they're resistant to many of the commonly used disinfectants in which we use. It's also quite difficult to detect oocysts in adult feces, which is why a lot of this research hasn't necessarily been done before, or the research which has been done is quite recent. However, there are new techniques which were published in 2016, which effectively is able to deal with the issues in which adult feces presents. And this is because in adult feces, we have a sort of fibrous nature to it, and it is also sort of increased in volume. And so therefore we can use these new sensitive techniques to be able to actually test adult cattle. The source of ursus to young calves is currently unknown. However, it is thought that they are picking it up from the environment somewhere. But what actually contributes to that environmental contamination of ursus is still unknown. So for part of my PhD, I was looking at the role of adult cattle, I was looking at the role of wildlife, and also there are other research projects going on which are looking at potential role of how the ursus survive within the environment as well. So it is predicted that adult cattle may be able to shed the same genotype, so the same sort of specific type of Cryptosporidium ursus that the calves do. And if they do shed the same type, then that might indicate that the adult cattle could potentially contribute to that environmental contamination of ursus and therefore present a risk to their calves. So for the study design, fecal samples from 79 adult dairy cattle were collected twice per week, and that was anywhere between 0 to 3 weeks before calving, and it really depended on when they calved. So some of them would calve that week, so they only had a couple of samples taken. Others, they were calving about 3 weeks later, and so had many more samples taken. The fecal samples were then collected from any of the female calves, as those which were the ones which were kept on farm, and they were collected 3 times a week until they reached 3 weeks of age. This was then followed by twice per week until they reached 6 weeks of age. And the reason for this is because young calves tend to show clinical signs of Cryptosporidium in those first couple of weeks of life. The samples were processed using the most sensitive technique available for adult cattle, and then also the previously published technique used for calves as well. Positive samples which occurred, so any which were positive for Cryptosporidium parvum, underwent something called multi-locus genotyping. And that's to really get a good look at the actual DNA and the genotype of that Cryptosporidium to determine if the genotypes between the dam and the calf matched. It was found that adult cattle predominantly shed Cryptosporidium parvum, either alone or as a mixed infection with another species. So 67.1% of the adult cattle were shedding Cryptosporidium parvum, either alone or as a mixed infection. And the other most commonly found species was Cryptosporidium andersoni, 41.8%. Now, this wasn't associated with any clinical signs of the disease, which is important to note. The calves were also predominantly shedding C. parvum. Now, this is consistent with previous research, and they were shedding C. parvum predominantly over the 6-week study period. We can see from this graph here the sorts of species in which they were shedding over that time period, with Cryptosporidium parvum being presented in red. We have Cryptosporidium bovis in a sort of dark green colour, Cryptosporidium ryani in yellow, and those species, bovis and ryani, tended to be seen a little bit later on, so from about week 3 onwards. This is consistent with previous research. However, what is new to this piece of research is that 25 of these calves were shown to be intermittently shedding ursus throughout the 6-week period. The majority of these had either just a single gap, although one of the calves actually had 4 gaps in the actual shedding of ursus. So this is really important because it's actually showing the importance of using longitudinal prevalence studies rather than just going in at a single time point and just doing a single sampling period. It's really important to do it over a period of time. So this is actually one of the first studies to examine longitudinal shedding profiles of Cryptosporidium in individual dairy calves over this 6-week period. Any of those animals, the adult cattle or the calves, which were positive for Cryptosporidium parvum, then underwent multilocus genotyping. So positive samples were genotyped at a couple of markers. So we had 5 different markers. We had the GP60, we had the MM5, MM18, MM19, and then the TP14 marker. The results were then used, they were all put together for those 5 markers, and they were assigned then a single number based on those 5 marker results. And that's called a multilocus genotype. We was then able to compare these multilocus genotypes between adult cattle and the calves. And this can be seen in the diagram on the slide. So essentially, the way that this diagram works is that it has the multilocus genotypes that were present on this farm. So there were 6 different genotypes here. So we had multilocus genotype 1, which was the most common in the calves. So it was 28 of these calves were shedding this. And this was also shown to be shed by 2 of the adult cattle. Now these little bubbles, which are the genotypes, if they share 4 out of the 5 markers, then they're joined by a line. So they're very, very similar to each other. So you can see the ones which are all joined together, they are quite similar. However, the majority of the adult cattle were actually in that multilocus genotype 9 bubble. And you can see that's not connected by a line, which means it is quite a bit more different. Or I think it was about 3, I think it shared either 2 or 3 of those markers. And so therefore it's quite different to what the calves have. So the majority of those adult cattle did not share the genotype in which the calves have, although 2 of them did. Now this work has recently been accepted for publication in current research in parasitology and vector-borne diseases. And so it should be live by the time you're listening to this presentation, and you can search it. In summary, Cryptosporidium parvum was the most prevalent species found in adult cattle and calves on this farm. And importantly, the calves demonstrated an intermittent shedding of ursus, which makes this one of the first studies to examine shedding profile on an individual basis in dairy calves from birth to 6 weeks of age. 2 of the adult cattle shed the same multilocus genotype that the majority of the calves were shedding, which indicates that adult cattle could potentially be a source of ursus to their calves. However, more work will be required to confirm this. So for instance, just because those adult cattle are shedding those ursus, we need to be able to determine how those ursus move through the environment and how they survive in the environment before they then have the ability to potentially reach their calves. So further work would include examining ursus movement and survival within the environment. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to Hannah for that presentation. Cryptosporidium parvum is certainly a major cause of enteric disease in neonatal calves, and Hannah's work has filled in some of the gaps in our knowledge of how Cryptosporidium is being transmitted within farms. But we move on now to Lucy Ross. Lucy is doing her PhD at the University of Nottingham, and her presentation is on heifer rearing targets and lifetime performance. Her topics of interest cover calf health and growth, age and weight at first calving, first lactation and lifetime performance and lifetime efficiency. So over to you, Lucy.
Thank you very much, Derek. And I think I can just about say good afternoon to everybody. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking to you about heifer rearing targets and lifetime performance. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background on heifer rearing targets and efficiency. So it's important to improve the rearing of replacements as they contribute towards the efficiency of the whole farm. And ultimately, we want to produce animals that will remain in the herd both profitably and productive. So the factors I'm interested in the rearing period are listed here, and I'm interested in these because I want to increase the number of heifers that calve at an age which optimises their lifetime performance. So here we've got young stock nutrition, health, growth, fertility and survival. And I've listed here a few terms which are quite useful when looking at heifer rearing efficiency. However, I won't go into details on those today. Some of them have already been alluded to in previous presentations, but I particularly want to focus on the costs associated with heifer rearing, and in particular the age at first calving. So as it has already been mentioned, rearing replacements are the second largest overhead on a dairy unit. This is following feed costs. So it is quite important that we want to ensure this process is as cost efficient as possible. So looking at age at first calving, it is a big contributor to rearing costs. And when looking at heifer rearing efficiency, I would want to look at what age and live weight your heifers are calving at first. And this isn't to say that these drivers aren't important, because they very much are. And they will help to contribute towards calving at the correct age. So next slide, please. So a few numbers from industry. So we're looking at about 12 to 35% of calves born alive not reaching their first calving, plus 17% of heifers that do calve don't complete their first lactation. So if we combine this with a repay time of 1.5 lactations, up to almost 45% of heifers born alive are not making a positive contribution to the herd. So currently we're looking at a mean age at first calving of around 27 months. This is longer than the long-standing recommendation of 24 months, and this has been unchanged since 2015. So a recent study by Bolton looked at rearing costs and age at first calving and found that for every day over this target age of 24 months, there is an additional cost of £2.87 per day. So there are improvements we can make in terms of rearing costs and the age at first calving. So looking at the performance data, we know that lowering the age at first calving does have a reduced first lactation milk yield. However, more of these heifers do survive to the second lactation, and this is really important when looking at repayment of the rearing costs. And lastly, looking at the lifetime performance, another study has shown that comparing an age at first calving of 22 months to 36 months, the early calvers gave a higher average daily lifetime yield. So as we can see, there are still improvements that we can make in terms of heifer rearing efficiency, and we particularly want to look at increasing the number of heifers that calve on target, exceed 1.5 lactations, and go on to have a successful milking life. So next slide, please. So before I go on to that data, I first just want to show actually how your means and averages can hide inefficiencies in your herd. So this data is taken from 900 or almost 900 Holstein Friesian dairy heifers born at the University of Nottingham into an all year round calving and housing system. So here we're looking at the age and mature weight at first calving in those heifers. And as you can see here, the distribution of age at first calving is highly variable. And you can see we've got an older tail, a long tail of older heifers here. So we took a range of 700 to 760 days, which is the equivalent of around 23 to 25 months. And the mean age at first calving in this herd just sits outside of that range. However, as you can see from this graph, it doesn't actually tell the whole story. So actually only 34% of these heifers calved on target, target age, but actually even fewer, only 7% calved at both the target age and percent mature weight. So as we also know, the live weight at first calving is equally as important, as heifers do grow throughout their first lactation. Therefore, heifers calving underweight will actually distribute more energy towards growth and less towards milk production, and this will further reduce their first lactation milk yield. So next slide, please. Again, I also just want to highlight the importance of actually calculating your herd mature weight. So this was taken from animals in the same herd in their third lactation and above, and between 100 to 200 days in milk. So as you can see here, over this 12-year period, the herd mature weight has steadily increased. And this is really important because if we are talking about targets in terms of percent mature weight, then the goalposts are changing year on year. For example, if we take 2008 and 2018 and we're looking at an 85% mature weight at first calving, then there's a difference in the live weight targets of approximately 80 kilos. So if we're then looking at the growth rate and we're assuming a birth weight of 45 kilograms, then those calving in 2008 had approximately a 0.66 kilograms per day compared to those in 2018, which were 0.77 kilos per day. And this really needs to be reflected in the nutrition that we offer these heifers, because the diet needs to stay suitable, and otherwise we need to adjust it to obtain these growth rates that we want to achieve. Next slide, please. So looking at the performance data here, again, this is using the same data set of heifers from the 900 heifers at Nottingham, split into their age at first calving. And as we can see here, those calving much later did also calve heavier, and this is to be expected as they did have more time to grow. However, what's more important is these early calving heifers, so those calving less than 23 months, did calve underweight. So as we've already mentioned, this puts them at a disadvantage when entering the milking herd, as they are of a smaller body size. So then looking at the rearing costs, we can see that these very late heifers cost on average just over £500 when compared to a heifer calving at 24 months. So in this herd, if we're looking to reduce that long tail of older heifers, then with 67 animals in this group, that's potentially a saving of £35,000. Moving on to milk yield, so looking at first lactation and lifetime milk yield, this data did confirm previous studies that the very late heifers did have the greatest first lactation milk yield. However, the early calving heifers did have the greatest lifetime milk yield. So these heifers did also have a greater number of productive days, so days in milk over unproductive days, and they also had a greater, more of these heifers exceeded their first, exceeded 1.5 lactation, therefore a greater number repaying their rearing costs. However, what is worth noting in this herd, if we look at the results from the target range and the late group, we can see that in terms of milk yield and days in milk over their lifetime, they gave quite similar values. So again, for this herd, if we want to reduce that longer tail, if we can move more of the animals out of the very late group into the late group even, there are potentially further improvements in cost and performance there. Next slide, please. So what does this mean in terms of heifer rearing efficiency? So from this herd, 32% didn't reach their first calving, and a further 19% didn't repay their rearing costs. So this brings us up to a figure of almost 50% of heifers born alive not making a positive contribution to the herd. So this is similar to the industry values that I mentioned earlier, and it does really highlight the importance of, one, heifer rearing efficiency, so looking at the percent of heifers born alive that calve at target age, but also more importantly, heifer rearing effectiveness, so those that also go on to survive beyond 1.5 lactations, which from this data, we're looking at the heifers calving earlier, so around 22 months or below 700 days, which gave the best lifetime performance and efficiency. Next slide, please. So in summary, it's really important to find the right target for your herd and to identify your inefficiencies are. So as we've already discussed, looking at means and averages is great, but it doesn't always tell the whole story. And then to look at what target is good for you, as it might not be suitable according to your system. So from this data set, we actually found that the heifers calving earlier, so again, below 23 months, did have the lower rearing cost, higher lifetime productivity, and also greater survival to, beyond 1.5 lactations. So again, we want to improve the heifer rearing efficiency, as this will improve the overall efficiency of the whole farm, but we also want to do this effectively. So for this farm, we would suggest looking at reducing that tail around the mean at age at first calving to increase the number achieving these targets, and also having a successful milking life. So thank you very much, and I look forward to taking any questions later.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you to the team who delivered all this research. We'll now move to the question session. So I'd invite all of the speakers who are with us this morning to switch on their cameras, and I will pass over to Emily Collins, our AHDB Dairy Knowledge Exchange Manager, who's going to lead the question session. Over to you, Emily. If you have any further questions while we're during the session, please enter them into the questions box on the right-hand side of the screen, and we will put them to the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek, and thank you everyone for your presentations. Got a few questions. I think we'll start one for Bobby. How much research is there on calf jackets? Are they effective even when possibly calves could become wet and cold? Someone said they do find them more hassle than help. So just a bit more information on that, please.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. That's a good question and quite a common question, I'd say, as well. Certainly in the research that we've done, both the kind of national level study and the more specific heat study, the jackets didn't seem to improve growth rates particularly. So that's not to say they definitely have zero effect. They might have a very small effect, but it's probably not that big, and it's certainly not as big as heat lamps. You're absolutely right as well. There's definitely a potential for them to do some harm. I think if they're left on, get very dirty, very wet, they're going to probably be worse than nothing, particularly if they don't get washed between calves as well. They can get quite mucky, and if they're not properly cleaned between calves, then you're basically just keeping a reservoir of muck and then giving it to the next newly born calf. So yeah, I think they can be quite useful in some circumstances, but they have to be kept dry, they have to be cleaned, otherwise they're probably worse than doing nothing. But even in the best circumstances, they're probably not going to give you enormous bumps in your production outcomes, in your growth rates. Probably better to focus on feeding and general environmental temperature.
All right, thank you. That's interesting. One for Robert. Do you think the choice of grazing site for heifers should include shelter, or possibly provide, whether that be natural, or should it be provided if there is no natural shelter?
Yeah, thanks. It's a common question. I suppose there's no scientific research which can quantify shelter. The site which we had to conduct our research on, it was open. There was trees surrounding the perimeter of the field, but it was a 40-acre field, and that was the reason why we did divide up, split our groups so that they weren't all experiencing the same weather, and that might have influenced results. As I say, the heifers on this study didn't have shelter, and anecdotally talking to some farmers over the years, they've said, well, if you provide shelter, it's only a reason for them to go and stand and muck up one side of the field, and they'll be all right without it. But as I say, it's only anecdotal. It's very hard to quantify that. The performances that we got here were without shelter, and I can speak from personal experience, standing up in that field some days at the start of March or even in the middle of the summer when the rain was coming sideways. It wasn't pleasant, and the heifers did huddle together. But as I say, that's the performance we got with that.
All right, thank you. And another one, I'll just merge a couple together. Do they need the same attention to detail for managing as milkers, as in the paddocks? And then another one was just kind of what grass height, what kilograms of dry matter would be best to put them on? Is that the same for milkers, and are you expecting the same residual? I know some farmers will just put heifers in to clear up after the cows, possibly. What kind of comments on that?
Yeah, well, I would say it's equally as important as the milkers. The grass that these heifers were grazing was close to as good as it could have been, and you couldn't get those live weight gains unless that the grassland management wasn't as good as it was. In terms of pre-grazing covers, because of the way the study was set up, and we didn't want to go in and mow or top any of the paddocks. And we didn't want to alter the rotations just so that we could look at the subsequent quality in those paddocks throughout the season. So pasture, to control pre-grazing heights, we varied the rotation length. So we varied it from a 2-day residency, which was 14-day rotation, up until a 24.5-day rotation. That was how we tried to manage that. But in the same time, the pasture the pre-grazing allowances were higher than we would have liked. In the lower pasture allowance, the pre-grazing covers were down 28, 29, but in the higher pasture allowance covers, I know especially for the in-calf heifers, those pre-grazing covers were up at 36. And in terms of residuals, those heifers when they were coming out, those in-calf heifers when they were coming out of those higher covers, they could have been leaving 22 to 24 behind them, which wasn't ideal. But at the same time, they were doing the most growing. One other thing I was saying that it's not as we would have expected, but heifers are very selective in grazing nature. So the animals on the higher pasture lines, they really just did more selecting on where they wanted to graze. Where they wanted to graze, they could have taken it down to 1,400 kilos of dry matter, and other parts where they didn't want to graze, they just left and it went to seed, and there was very patchy pockets all over the paddocks. So I would say the quality of the grass where they were grazing really tight was probably as good as the lower pasture lines. I think that answers the question. I might have missed something, but
yeah. No, I think so. No, thank you. And one for Lucy. We are currently pro-crossing our herd, Holstein, Montbéliard and Swedish Red. How will daily live weight gain targets differ to Holstein Friesian targets?
That's a really good question. Perhaps slightly out of my remit, is I love genetics, but not the biggest geneticist here. But
I guess just more a general then, how would breed and stature affect
the growth rate? Well, I'd say going from our herd, we are looking at much bigger cows here, and I think that is affecting their growth rate. So we are needing to push them to reach a higher live weight at first calving. So we're having to feed those calves to reach those. I would say crossing them with the Montbéliard and Swedish, I would expect similar results, but I think it's all about looking at your own individual herd performance. Like as we found here, the targets that are given for industry aren't necessarily the best targets for this herd. So it's really looking at your own herd, what works for your herd and the growth rates that you can achieve with the system you've got. So again, I think there would be a breed effect, but I would say more importantly is looking at your herd individually and your system.
And this is just one that I've thought of. Did you have a percent of adult weight met when at first calving? If they were calving at 22 months, what percent of their adult weight were they? Do you know what that was?
So the average percent we found was 72%. But I am doing more work into looking at calculations for mature weight, so looking at either their own individual mature weight, the calculation that I used on this data set, so looking at third and above and between 100 to 200 days in milk, because really the gold standard would be, are they meeting 85% of their own mature weight? But obviously that data is harder to come by and to calculate, so that is a little bit of work that I'm trying to do myself, looking at that, because actually they might be smaller cows and they only need to have a lower mature weight, so actually they could be calving at a higher percent mature weight, but using the average of the whole herd, then they do come under slightly underweight.
Okay, thank you. And then another one for you, Bobby. What effects do you think you would see as a temperature increase above 15 to 17 degree max shown in the data you have shown? Is there a cutoff above which you won't see an effect?
Yeah, there definitely is, and I think David's graph with that Goldilocks temperature is really nice. And actually, if you go too high, then of course you might see some detriment. And young calves are much less susceptible to that than adult cows. But adult cows, if you go anything above about 20 or 25, then they start to get a bit too hot to handle it. But it's generally probably about 12 degrees, something like that. So around about 12 degrees, if they're colder than 12 degrees, that's going to start to limit their performance. So as a general rule, if you go into your shed with a t-shirt on and without a hat on, then and you're too cold, then the calves are probably too cold as well. Really easy way to monitor that is just to get one of these very simple minimum maximum thermometers. that are about £10 off Amazon, and put one of those in the shed and just see how cold that temperature gets at night. It's often quite surprisingly cold, and if it's going below 12 degrees, then certainly something you need to think about in terms of how do you mitigate that, because they will be limiting their performance if they're probably below about 12-15 degrees, something like that.
Okay, thank you. And then leading on from that, if for calves fed on milk powder, would you recommend increasing the concentration of the mix during colder weather, and what ratio?
Yeah, you can do. I mean, lots of people really like doing that. I certainly wouldn't go above about 150 grams per litre, and really there's not really very much point in doing that. I don't think. Calves with their mother would drink kind of 10 to 12 litres a day, so there's no real need to make this really thick soup so that they just drink 2 or 3 litres. You might as well just give them more milk, so they're still getting the same amount of solids, just in a larger volume. I don't think there's any point in really bumping up that concentration past about 150 grams per litre, which lots of people do anyway. But certainly the overall volume of milk that's being fed, really just trying to replicate what that calf would be doing with its mother. So drinking little and often if possible, although not all systems you can do that, and drinking kind of 8 to 10 litres a day as soon as possible really would be absolute gold standard. But certainly 6 to 8 litres a day we found was quite important.
Okay, thank you. And just on colostrum, similar question, I guess, with the change or a different type or breed, perhaps a smaller calf, what kind of would you recommend? Just splitting the colostrum feed?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I suppose we're all guilty of thinking in black and white, aren't we? Yeah, certainly for smaller things like jerseys, I mean, really you're shooting for about kind of 8 to 10% body weight, something like that. So if you've only got a 30 kilo calf, don't try and put 4 litres in. It's probably not the best idea. But almost all the time, I would say people underdo colostrum rather than overdo it. And splitting into feeds, I mean, people do that, but some of the research suggests it's that very first feed that's the most important. So probably best to get as much as you can in that first feed, up to about 10% body weight. And then if you want to do another feed 6 hours later with some more, that's fine, but it's the first feed is really what's crucial. So yeah, it does have to be calf specific, but be very careful you're not underdoing colostrum, which is probably the most common thing, rather than overdoing all that, although certainly worth considering as well.
All right, thank you. And then one for Robert. Do you have any suggestions for a worming protocol for heifers at grass?
So for the heifers in our study, we followed a fairly strict 3 to 4 week worming protocol. However, we were dabbling with the fecal egg counts. The problem at that stage was that we weren't doing the fecal egg counts regularly enough, and I think best practice from an anthropometric point of view is probably to routinely do a fecal egg count, maybe every 1 or every other week, and that means that you have a clear picture for your own calves in that group, and you can see increases or decreases rather than just going and taking a one-off sample and saying, oh no, they're fine, or perhaps you get a sample from a calf that's good in a group and one couldn't be. When you're treating on a group basis, it's difficult to get a representative sample as well. But I think the way things are going with anthropometrics and resistances and all the rest of it, that really is the best practice.
All right, thank you. And then another one for Lucy, or a couple. Most farmers struggle to weigh heifers and calves. Have you got any tips on the best equipment and handling to make it easier? And then secondly, how often should farmers be weighing adult cattle, and where in their point of lactation?
Yeah, so for the first part, what was the first part of the question, sorry?
Sorry, just managing weighing calves. And
yeah, so it is tricky if you don't have the facilities. There is a lot of research going on in sort of algorithms and looking at weighing bands and the measurements and estimations with those. I mean, the best points would be, you know, a pre-post and weaning, or when you're moving these animals to fit in more of the movements and welfare of those. But I mean, we're very lucky that this data is at an all year round housing facility, so we do have the facilities to easily weigh them with a portable weighing facility. But again, it's sort of a cost expense in the system. My best guess would be if you can weigh band them as regularly as you can, then that would be great, because if you're not measuring it, then you can't manage it, but you've got to do the best you can. And just eyeballing an animal just isn't good enough. I mean, you can get all sorts of shapes and sizes. So definitely at the point of weaning, I think another estimation is looking at sort of 10 months, so 50% of mature weight at that stage, and then again at breeding, so sort of 55-60% mature weight, and then obviously at calving. But then in terms of the adult cows, again, this herd uses a robotic system, so we're able to use the weight cells loaded to the robotic system and getting that off the Lely data set. So again, we've got the facilities through those robotic milking machines. Again, it opens up a whole world of different data you can collect from those. So probably in terms of weighing on mature animals, that is a lot trickier. You can't put a weight band around those, but this is how we did it in this study.
Oh, and just another last one. When were the weights at first calving taken? Was it pre or post calving, or a certain number of days from calving?
Yeah. So this was taken an average of the 7-day postpartum. So.
Okay, thank you. It's useful. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there for questions, and I'll hand back to Derek for a little bit of summary. But thank you, everyone, and thank you, everyone that submitted questions.
Good. Thank you, Emily, and like I say, thank you to those who submitted those questions. Thank you to our presenters who joined us this morning, and for those who provided film presentations, and to all the research groups and to all the farmers who took part in those different research studies. I think what's coming out of this morning's series of presentations is the importance of having the evidence about what you're doing to drive best practice behavior and improve efficiency of production. We heard from David Bell about the importance of the effective environmental temperature and its effect on the growth rates of calves. That also came out in Robert Hyde's work as well, and I would encourage you to go and look at and try out the Herd Health Toolkit on the University of Nottingham website. I'm sure Robert would welcome any feedback on that, and he's keen to produce a herd health plan that is both effective at farm level, but is evidence-based and helps farmers achieve that target of heifers calving down at the right weight and age. That's also something that Robert Patterson was keen to look at in his work. Some great advice there on optimum pasture allowances for replacement heifers, and it really helped our understanding of grazing strategies and how best to meet those targets, and the importance of monitoring and measuring as you go along. Something that Lucy also referred to in terms of meeting target weights, the importance of monitoring and measuring, and ideally you do this as often as you possibly can to make sure that animals are on target. And Robert also highlighted the importance of not getting those heifers over fat by giving them too much pasture. And I think with the increase in prices of nitrogen, and that we'll all be looking at how we can use pasture as efficiently as possible next year. Hannah Shaw talked to us about Cryptosporidium, and this is a real challenge on farms. Adult animals may be a source, but the environment, cows may also be picking those oocysts up from the environment. It certainly significantly reduces weight gain when you have a severe outbreak of cryptosporidiosis. And it's important, obviously, that calves go into clean environments and that we try and eliminate the exposure of calves to Cryptosporidia in the first place where that is possible. And then Lucy talked to us about the importance of efficiency in our rearing of dairy heifers, so that we maximize the performance while limiting rearing costs. And if you can calve those heifers down at the right age, you will get a higher lifetime production and a greater survival into the next lactation. So thank you all for building that evidence base that helps us reduce our rearing costs and get those heifers to the calving down at the right age and the right weight, and to get the best lifetime production for them. So this brings the Dairy Research Conference to a close. My thanks to all of the speakers this week and all of the research groups who've contributed. I know that we only get to hear you for 10 minutes, but there's an awful lot of work goes into that, behind all of that. Thank you also to the team that helped put this Dairy Research Conference together and deliver it, and to the team behind the scenes, Carrie-Anne and others who kept the technology working almost as seamlessly as possible. So thank you to everybody. Thank you especially to those who attended all of these sessions this week. All of the sessions will be available on YouTube, and those who registered for today's sessions will get a link sent to them by Monday. And I think it's been great over the last 10 years working with the University of Nottingham and all of the other universities, SRUC, Harper Adams, Royal Vet College, on this research. And I think it has really helped build our evidence base and help us improve the efficiency of British dairy production. And it's been a great investment of Levy Fair funds. So thank you all. And with that, we will close the conference.